All right, we're live. Welcome to Traditional Right Live. This is our second episode. I'm your host, Brent. Tonight, I'm joined by our facilitator and fellow editor, John. How you doing, John?
What's up, guys?
We've got Jeff Groom. How are you, Jeff?
Good. Glad to be here.
And of course, we've got Mr. William S. Lind. How are you, Bill?
Pretty good, and I'll be better as the bottle goes down.
Of course, of course. And you said that's real port from Portugal, not real port from the United States.
And those who remember our old Next Revolution television show on NET will be happy to know these are the same glasses we used there. And the wine was real on that show, too.
I know I said last time that we're going to do these every single week, and that's still the intention. So don't get too mad. We had a couple weeks off for Thanksgiving. That'll be my excuse.
We just figured that the Italian general staff was handling this campaign rather than the German.
Sure. Once again, the intention behind this show is to have a relatively casual discussion about the week's news or anything tangentially related to current events. As always, we're going to encourage participation from our live audience. If you have questions, put it into the live chat or comments. And if you don't want to submit them live, or you are listening to this after it is already posted, go ahead and send us an email at traditionalright@gmail.com. So before we get started, I'm getting an echo from somebody. I don't know whose it is.
You talking about a click or echo from a voice?
I'm hearing my voice twice.
I only hear your voice once, so I'm not.
Yeah, I only hear yours.
We're only hearing you once.
Okay, it must not be too bad then. All right, so fine. Live technical issues, that'll happen. So the first point in the news that I want to hit was the Paris riots. I'm seeing on social media today that there's a lot of action happening in Paris. There's some basically mayhem happening in Paris yesterday and today. And this all started over a gas tax, allegedly. That was the spark that started it. What I'm seeing is that the police are in some places they're fighting the protesters, but then I also saw that there was a group of police that made a show of taking off their helmets and armor and joining the protesters. The firefighters kind of made a big deal about turning their backs to the elected officials in some kind of ceremony before they marched away. I'm seeing a museum of modern art that was set on fire, and of course, nothing of value was lost.
By definition.
Yeah, right. Just as a comment off the top of my head, I'm always kind of wary of these quote unquote revolutions that kind of materialize out of nowhere. And that's what this one feels like to me. It just kind of blew up overnight. It feels sort of manufactured in some way, in the same way that the Ukrainian revolution did. And of course, that was a CIA operation.
I think the two are in fact very different. This is a long French tradition. There's nothing new about this in France. The French take to the streets very easily. They have done so for centuries. And what's interesting about this is not that the French are taking to the streets. What's interesting about it is this is not a directly political action. In other words, it's not the left or the right. It's not the socialists against the conservatives or anything like that. This is a grassroots phenomenon, bottom up, that has obviously been tremendously facilitated by a lot of the new technologies. But what it's really about is a new politics of massive popular resistance to globalism. The people who are taking to the streets in France are the same as the people here in Cleveland who voted for Donald Trump, because they have watched their living standards drop steadily for decades, while the globalist elites just say, well, nothing can be done about it. This is the verdict of the market, tough cookies. Meanwhile, we're living very well. It's an anti-elite rebellion. It's a rebellion against all the elites, the political elites, the financial elites, the intellectual elites, the whole works, on the part of ordinary people whose standards of living have just been dropping and dropping and dropping. And this is a phenomenon we're going to see a lot more in the developed world.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to make mention of is that I think it's interesting that it's not ethnic displacement, it's not cultural destruction, it's a gas tax that kind of sets this off. And maybe that's a lesson for American rightists. If you want to, foment angst, you really have to show that the pain in your pocketbook comes from the other side. It doesn't really seem like anything that truly matters motivates people to action.
Well, when you say that, it tipped it off, like I would agree with Bill. He's, maybe it was just the match that lit the gasoline that had already been poured on this situation. Like you said, they've been pushed for so long, and this might have just been the last thing that made them snap, so to speak. I mean, the Front National, one of their slogans was, globalization is slave labor selling to the unemployed. And I think that's probably the best single sentence about globalization. It's like these people don't have jobs, but they just have access to maybe cheap goods, but that doesn't do it for them. So, but I don't see a ethnic dimension to it, even though there probably will be in the future. Just recently, there was a Zero Hedge article talking about a former French minister that walked around the country and said multiculturalism essentially failed, and we're living shoulder to shoulder now, but in the next 5 years, he said, we're going to be living face to face. So even though this protest I don't think has that aspect to it, I think you're right to say there's to split the two issues between maybe economic anger, which this is, and then there's going to be another aspect to it in the future, which we're also seeing now, but even more so in the future, which is the failure of multiculturalism, especially in France, like in the UK.
We have to understand the French taxes take about 45% of the French gross domestic product. I think the figure here is a bit under 20%.
Right.
And so the people, on the one hand, they're losing their jobs. If they can get a job, it doesn't pay as much as the job they used to have. And at the same time, their taxes are going up. They see the immigrants getting all of these benefits, which they don't get. And they see the elites, the 1%, who, in effect, nothing can ever be good enough for them. And this is building resentment again against all of the elites. It's very interesting that the police and the fire have been going over. That's exactly what I anticipate will happen more and more, because they come from the same people. They come from the same families. And they are not going to protect the elites by hosing their own people. So if the elite lose their security services, well, we did see this in France before in 1789. It tends to get a little messy for the elite.
Yeah. The king and his wife took the scaffold to the guillotine.
And so did a lot of others.
Right. Yeah.
It is worth noting also that all the right people are against this. I'm seeing the liberals and journalist types are all kind of saying, this is bad political violence coming from the right. So that is a good sign.
Yeah, it's not one of the interesting things here. Both the left and the right are trying to ride this, but they're not succeeding. In effect, they are part of the same establishment that the people are rejecting. They're rejecting the whole of the establishment.
They wait long enough to commit to any side, long enough to make sure they're on the right one, basically. So they're going to wait as long as they can to see who's going to be, come out to blame for this. So they're not going to play their hand quickly. It's similar to the Kavanaugh situation. We have, politicians sit on their hands until they can kind of see where the public might sit on this, and because re-election is the ultimate goal.
Yeah, they see which way the wind is blowing.
Yeah.
You'll remember, political leadership is figuring out which way the crowd is going and getting out in front of it.
Right.
So yeah, Bill, do you think that there's like a fourth generation warfare element to this? Do we have to worry about the state collapsing or getting into trouble?
That's a very interesting question. At this point, I don't have an answer to it. Certainly something I'm thinking hard about. It certainly has some characteristics of fourth generation war. It is not primarily about the state. Its goals are not simply political, though they're partially so. It has a variety of motivations in it. Obviously, it escapes the Clausewitzian trinity of government, people, and army. It transcends those. Martin van Crefeld, its term for fourth generation war is non-Trinitarian war, referring to that Clausewitzian trinity. So it's up in the air at the moment. I think it probably does have relevance or does have a place in fourth generation war, but it's not clear to me at this point where it fits.
Fair enough. Really, the thing that I thought was the most interesting was the police going over, and that's really at this point it's just something to watch. We don't really know where to go with it at this point.
At that point, the state is in trouble, not just the government. At that point, the state itself is in trouble.
Yeah. Okay, anyone want to add anything else to that before we move on?
Nope.
All right.
I think that covers it.
All right, one little nugget I wanted to hit was George H.W. Bush, who of course passed away. I was too young to remember his presidency. All I know is that he was a CIA spook. He knows where the bodies are buried in Iran-Contra. And he kind of opened the door for American police actions as a foreign policy with the Gulf War. Bill, I wanted to get your take on Bush 1. I know you're not, you don't really want to speak ill of the recently departed, but can you give us a brief take?
We historians usually wait a decent interval before we savage them.
Sure.
But the fact of the matter is that he is certainly not going to go down in the list of great presidents. He'd be a great guy to have had as next door neighbor, very decent sort of fellow, but he was not somebody who could think strategically. He did start our disastrous involvement in the Persian Gulf region, which was obviously a major blunder. After his administration had given Saddam the go-ahead to invade Kuwait, Saddam asked our State Department representative in the region, and she, no surprise there, gave him a green light.
Damn women.
Exactly. Well, perhaps she should have stuck to biscuits, but the fact of the matter is that she blew it. She gave him a green light. Saddam thought he had our okay. He moved, and then we pulled the rug out from under him. And that began the destruction of the state of Iraq. Now, Bush 1, to his credit, who was a heck of a lot brighter than Bush 2, did know enough not to destroy the state in Iraq. It took his idiot son to do that. But he unquestionably put us on the road there toward the colossal mess we have now created.
But they had WMDs.
Yes, absolutely. I think in Iraqi Arabic that translates as indoor plumbing.
But how else were we going to try out all our new toys? You wouldn't really get to see the stealth fighter in action without the Gulf War.
Well, the really interesting thing militarily about the Gulf War is that our performance was pretty poor. On the operational level, our objective, as General Schwarzkopf repeatedly states in his memoirs, was the destruction of the Iraqi Republican Guard. Well, we failed. It got away. By the time the very slow-moving 7th Corps finally closed the sack, the Republican Guard was out of it. And Schwarzkopf had only one decision to make during the whole campaign, which was switching the Schwerpunkt from Franks with 7th Corps, who clearly had failed, to McCaffrey, who still had a chance to close the sack and create the Kessel higher up in Iraq. And Schwarzkopf didn't do it. So afterwards, the US Army was saying, well, we've now showed the Russians we know something about operational art. Well, we showed the Russians we know how to spell the term. We didn't show them anything else.
But wasn't the main objective to get Iraq out of Kuwait? So, I mean, they succeeded in doing that.
They succeeded in doing that, which was not terribly difficult, to be honest. It was mostly third-line Shiite reservists garrisoning Kuwait. But again, the operational objective, according to Schwarzkopf, was the destruction of the Republican Guard. And that was clearly our political objective as well. We hoped, without our intervening directly in Iraq, which again, at least Bush 1 was smart enough not to do that, would nonetheless, the loss of the Republican Guard would bring down Saddam. And obviously that didn't happen. So from that perspective, Gulf War I for us was a tactical victory, but it was against pretty much a tethered goat, an operational failure and a strategic draw. We forced them out of Kuwait, but Saddam remained in power. We now know, with virtue of hindsight, that we were very fortunate that Saddam remained in power, and we can only wish that he was still in power today.
Yeah, no kidding. You mentioned Russia. This week, Russia and Ukraine had a little bit of a dust-up where Russia allegedly seized some Ukrainian naval vessels. What's the story there? What's going on? What happened?
The story is very little happened. The Russians, of course, have annexed Crimea, which historically has always been Russian. No big issue there. And they want to make the Sea of Azov essentially a closed sea. There is still some Ukrainian littoral there, but not much. And the Ukrainians decided to stage an incident, mainly because their current president faces an election in March, which he would dearly love to postpone, and he's projected to lose.
10% approval rating and something like that.
Yes, yeah. So it's not terribly difficult to see why the Ukrainians created this, again, very, very minor incident. What is interesting, and Jeff, I'd like to get your take on this, because you just came back from speaking at the American Conservative Magazine's Foreign Policy Conference in Washington, which I've done a number of times in the past.
Yeah.
Now, one of the major themes there, and it's probably the major foreign policy battle in Washington in the current administration, is the battle between foreign policy realism and Wilsonianism. Realism recognizing that foreign policy is amoral. It is a matter of interests, raison d'etat. It has nothing to do with good guys and bad guys, black hats and white hats. And the Wilsonianism, which was really renamed Jacobinism, is the idea that the United States is going to dictate to everyone in the world how they should live, which of course means freedom and democracy and Jacobin definitions of human rights and all of the rest of the nasty package.
And properly charge them for the convenience.
And charge them for the convenience, and if necessary, force it down their throats with stealth bombers. So President Trump is clearly drawn to the realist side. We saw that in his correct reaction to the murder of this Saudi named Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Turkey. This obviously has nothing to do with us. He was not a US citizen. It didn't happen on US soil. It is a part of the world where most of the rulers come to power after they push their father through a heart. So, big deal. And Trump recognized that and said, I'm not going to wreck our relationship with our main oil source over some Arabs killing another Arab. Yet on this very minor incident between Russia and Ukraine, he took the Wilsonian approach, and so I'm going to cancel my meeting with Putin because that wasn't nice, as if niceness had anything to do with foreign affairs. So, Jeff, did this kind of thing come up in the conference down there? Where do you see this going within this administration?
Yeah, the conference had a couple different panels, and the ones that they were really talking about, realism, restraint, would probably been in the last two when they had some people from the national interest were there, a couple others, but they talked about Iran, and then they talked about China. At the very beginning, they talked kind of about the AMUF, authorization used for military force, and then Rand Paul spoke as well about, he spoke mainly about Saudi Arabia versus Iran and how, well, Saudi Arabia funded the hijackers. They're the base of almost all Islamic terror that kills Americans across the world. So why are we enemies? But to your point about realism versus restraint, I don't know that there's that many times that they brought that up in the panel specifically. Like this should be our policy based off of, like you mentioned, we have permanent interests. Like who those people are, does it really matter? Like if they're the most moral people, well, no, it shouldn't. It should just matter like what's in our interest. So I don't know if I should hit in on any of the. Do you want to know about more specifically about any one of those individual panels? Because I took some notes on most of them, but
I think that the American Conservative, of course, was founded as a voice for realism in foreign policy.
Right.
That remains its primary mission. I think it, on the whole, does that mission very well.
Right.
So at least we have some voice in Washington for realism.
Right.
But what we see here more than anything is how the Trump administration works, or rather doesn't work, because the president is so often isolated within his own administration.
Right.
He has all of these Wilsonians around him, all of the globalists, the people who want American world hegemony and somehow think you can afford it. And his instincts correctly are the other way. And sometimes he follows them, and other times he lets them beat him into submission, and he takes a position a little different from what Obama would have taken.
Right. Yeah. At the conference, we talked about, how they brought that up just briefly about his instincts, but I guess just my own take about his instincts is, yes, I would completely agree with you that he ran even before this Russia thing started. His instincts told him, well, we have a massive state in Russia that has a powerful military. The Cold War's been over for 28 years. Like, what are we enemies over anymore at this point? Does anyone really know? And that's what he ran on. He wins. Then lo and behold, the state, reasserts itself because we have to have an enemy to justify the military-industrial complex and having the bases in Europe and all those things. So I completely agree. Trump's instincts are where they need to be, but I'm kind of disappointed in him because he's just, your instincts are there. Why do you not hire people that toe the line on your instincts? Why are you hiring former neoconservatives like John Bolton? Why are you hiring these type of people that are completely opposed to what your instincts are? That's what he can't do that a lot. He's kind of chained to this Russia investigation, so he can't actually become friends with Russia, which is like you said, we should be. But it amazes me that, Russia was killing 40,000 people a month in 1937 and 38 in the purges, and the United States recognized them in 1933, and then we fought World War II side by side with them. So clearly, like in the past, we've realized that you can be friends with people that aren't so nice to their own people if it's in our interest. But now Russia's not killing any of your own citizens, but apparently we can't be friends with them now. I mean, it's pretty ridiculous. So.
It may be in our best interest that when we got to Berlin in World War II, we just kept on going, like George Patton said.
Right.
Bygones be bygones on that.
Yeah.
But Churchill, at the end of the war, when he saw that the Soviets had taken half of Europe, said, "We slaughtered the wrong pig."
Yeah, right. But the take I have, I guess, on the Russian confrontation, I was talking to my folks about this because they didn't really. I read a book this year about the Crimean War and a couple other books about Russian histories. The Russians lost 450,000 men in the Crimean War just to keep that peninsula. It was actually one of the longest sieges in military history against the French, the British, and the dying Ottoman Empire. And 1783, backing before that, Catherine the Great annexed Crimea after a war with the Turks, annexed it, and then Nikita Khrushchev gave the Crimea to Ukraine in an act of goodwill in 1954. But until that time, the Russians had moved off the Tartars. It was a culturally Russian place, and it was one of their only two warm water ports. And what Bill talked about with the revolution in Ukraine, the Russians had actually leased that port from Ukraine up through 2042. But then when the revolution knocked out their president, they said, we're not going to let you use the port anymore. So that's when the Russians essentially, launched their hybrid war and took it back. So put yourself in their shoes. They only have two warm water ports for their Navy, and the West is threatening to take one away. Like, what would you do if you were in their shoes? Of course, they would have to take that port back. And then
they had every reason to seize the Crimea.
Absolutely.
Well,
Yeah, but I don't even say seizing is the right word. They occupied what is their port that's been there forever. So it's like, how would we feel if the Russians were in the Baja Peninsula doing an exercise with the Mexicans right next to San Diego? Like, people would be furious. But that's what we did to them, and then people wonder why they're mad.
Yeah, context is important.
Yes,
Yeah.
context is important, and this, of course, touches a bit also on this farce of an investigation of Trump for any ties to Russian meddling in the 2016 election. We meddle in foreign elections all the time.
Right.
When the Ukrainians elected through a perfectly fair, normal, legal election, a pro-Russian president, we organized a coup to overthrow him. And this was just a few years ago.
Right.
So we have a long history of messing around in other people's internal politics.
Right.
What do we expect? We seem to, the Washington establishment thinks there's one set of rules for us and another set of rules for everyone else.
Right.
Well,
Right.
other people aren't going to play by that.
I mean, China meddles in our internet every single day as far as
And we in
our
theirs.
code
And we in theirs. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, in fact, Iran, I mean, we overthrew their democratically elected leader in 1953 with the help of the CIA. Like, I'd be pissed at America, too, if somebody knocked out our democratically elected leader. So, yeah. Another thing at the foreign policy conference, only one person really brought it up, that, it's obviously the elephant in the room to a lot of people, but it's, our relationship with Israel. Like, why do we want to be friends with Saudi Arabia? Well, because Israel is afraid of Iran, and so they see, as Bill said, they're not stupid anymore. They saw that knocking out Iraq was a complete disaster, and so now they're attaching to another state power, which is Saudi Arabia. Therefore, they want us to be friends with Saudi Arabia too, which, I mean, we have no permanent friends in that part of the world, but we do have interests, so I agree with you, Bill. I mean, we're going to be friends with Saudi Arabia no matter what, and so they let they kill one of their own people.
Do you think it's more in our interest to be the unconditional friend to Israel as opposed to Saudi Arabia?
Again, as Charles Ball said, nations have no permanent friends, only permanent interests. Our interest in...
I would say Israel would definitely be a permanent interest. Ever since 1948, we've been...
Well, it certainly has been a permanent interest. There's no question about that. Exactly what the basis for that permanent interest is beyond the political basis that we're all aware of, is an interesting question. There's no question we share a certain cultural commonality with Israel. It's a modern, if you will, Western state in a non-modern, non-Western region. Right. But at the same time, unfortunately, Israel doesn't have any oil.
Right. Yeah.
And Saudi Arabia and Iran and Iraq all have quite a bit of it.
Right. And
even though we're now the world's largest oil producer, we are not self-sufficient. It only took a 5% drop in our oil supplies in 1973 and 79 to have the gas lines and the gas stations putting up signs, no gas.
Right.
You're too young to remember that, but I remember it very well.
Yeah.
And it was just a 5% drop. So quite rightly, we regard our interest in oil as perhaps the most important interest we have in the region.
Speaking of George H.W. Bush.
Right.
Yeah.
The oil, yeah. Well, both Bushes were the oil administration.
Yeah.
No question about it. Have we covered the week's news at this point pretty well? If so,
well, I kind of wanted to hit on the U.S. and China had a talk in Argentina this week about trade. Apparently, they're going to have a 90-day truce over the institution of new tariffs. It says here that the 25% tariff on Chinese goods is basically still on the table at this point, but not to be implemented for at least 90 days. From the conservative point of view, or real conservative point of view, don't we think that protectionism is good?
Yes, we industrialize this country under tariff protection. And if we're going to reindustrialize so that people in places like Cleveland find their living standards again rising rather than falling, we need tariff protection. There's no question about it. And President Trump has done something that should have been done many administrations ago and finally taken the Chinese on the fact that they've been vacuum cleaning all of our industry and moving it to China. We have had factories in Cleveland torn down and re-erected in China. And now the jobs, those well-paying jobs, are Chinese jobs. So the Chinese rip off everybody's intellectual property. They pay no attention to patents, copyrights, or anything else. They demand technology transfer if you're going to do any business with them. And finally, we have a president who said, wait a minute. The Chinese are following the economic philosophy called mercantilism, while we play a free market game. Well, guess which one works better? Mercantilism, by the way, was the dominant economic school in the 17th and 18th centuries. And the mercantilist countries, it was originally Japan and South Korea, now it's primarily China, they just sucked all the good jobs out of this country. So the president's exactly right on that. Where he isn't right, in my view, is letting that lead to a general bad relationship with China. I did a column not long ago on this. We need to separate our position on trade from our position on other issues with China, so that we do not react to a rising China the way Britain reacted to a rising Germany. In the end, that destroyed both the German and the British empires. We need to accommodate the rise of China. We need to accommodate the fact that China is becoming, again, as it has been through most of history, a great power. But we can decouple those issues. We don't have to say, well, we're going to have bad relationships on everything because we have trade disputes. We also have a way of dealing with trade disputes with China because they are a state-controlled economy, which is called managed trade. And that, I think, is what President Trump is going for here. And I think the Chinese are trying as well. And that's why I think this delay of 90 days in new tariffs is probably a good idea. What managed trade means is simply that we would sit down with the Chinese. We would say, we're going to buy X, Y, and Z from you. You're going to buy A, B, and C from us. And we're going to work it so we come out with a rough balance. If we can do that, then trade can be mutually beneficial. The vacuum cleaner is shut off. I'm hoping that's where the president's going. I think that's where he's trying to go. But I am concerned that people like Bolton in this administration, who should not be in this administration, are trying to create a generally bad relationship with China. And frankly, that's dangerous.
Wasn't Bolton the guy that claimed originally they had WNDs?
Yes, Bolton is one of the dumbest of the neocons. That's saying a lot.
Do you think it complicates things, since China and us, it's kind of being framed as we have a rope around our neck as we have a gun to their head? How do you get away from that being an aspect of really keeping everything off the table except for trade? Do you think that complicates things as far as how we go about talking about it?
No, again, I think not. I think the Chinese are realists in foreign policy, very much so. And I think they're quite capable of dividing trade issues from other issues. For example, China's expanding military power in the South China Sea. So what? Is China a threat to free navigation? No, China depends completely on free navigation. China has to import by sea massive amounts of energy and massive amounts of food. They are completely dependent on safety of sea lines of communication. They're not going to be shutting that down. We can work with them on that, and we can say to them very frankly, as your power expands, if the yellow man wants to share the white man's burden of keeping order in the world, China, you are welcome to do so. It is a thankless and expensive task. If they want to do it in more parts of the world as our power recedes, that's entirely for the good, so long as we preserve what is in their interest and ours, which is peace, order, and commerce.
I have no problem with accommodating China's rise in China's natural sphere of influence.
Right.
What kind of bothers me is their expansion into Africa. Not for any moral reasons. I don't really care that they're extracting resources from China. I wish we did the same. But the fact is we don't do the same. They they have a very exploitative relationship with Africa, and they don't have any problems with that. They don't have any moral hangups in the way that we would. How do we address China while they're willing to go and do things like that without any kind of moral hangups? Because they don't have the same impediments, moral impediments that we do. How can we possibly keep up?
The answer is we invite them to get to the swamp with the tar baby. Africa is a bottomless pit. The Chinese are already beginning to discover that. The only time Africa has ever come close to working is when it was all European colonies. And if the Chinese want to try to go in now and work in Africa as it is today, they will pour in tremendous amounts of effort and resources. In the end, they will find they get virtually nothing out. The key rule for Africa is stay out of it. If they want to break that rule, I'm not going to get in their way.
That's the rule for Afghanistan, too.
Yeah.
That's the rule for a great many places in the world that we unfortunately keep trying to stick our noses into.
Right.
China also has a tendency lately to start buying up land in America and Europe. How should we approach that? They are colonizing our countries too.
I don't know that it's all colonization, but I think a lot of their, entrepreneurial class that's boomed because of their, rising economy is dumping US dollars in other countries to buy real tangible assets with our essentially worthless fiat currency. And you're seeing the Chinese government is also dumping US Treasury bonds. So they're not buying as much debt as they used to have of ours. So I don't know how that dynamic's working totally, but I think a lot of it is they're just trying to get something tangible for all the U.S. dollars that we send them, willingly because our consumers want the cheap shit. So that's fine. But I don't know that it's all strategic. It just might be that they've got a lot of money to play with and they want to buy something, real. Because, you see they do have like a taste for some, Western things, like Cadillacs and all that stuff. Like they are intrigued in a way by, Western society. So I don't know. What's your take on that?
Sure, but they also come here for college and for jobs and whatnot, and they practice ethnic nepotism. So right. you'll get Chinese into positions of power, and then they'll just invite more Chinese and displace anybody else that was, native to our country and able to fill those positions. They also practice spying routinely for the Chinese government while they're here. They send information in these from these university research programs and send them over to the Chinese state. How do we approach China when they're willing to do these things and we don't?
Well, but we have done a lot of these things ourselves historically. Remember how in our early industrial revolution, how much we stole from Britain, doing the same kinds of things for how to build the looms and all of the rest of the equipment that began our industrial revolution in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. The only reason we could build canals here is because we had to bring over English engineers to design them for us. So this is not an unusual phenomenon with a country that, we have to remember this about China, 20 years ago was dirt poor. China's rise is very recent and very fast. And by the way, a lot of it's a bubble. I think the coming international debt crisis is likely to start in China, in part for reasons that you just talked about, Brett, that they're going around the world buying up everything.
Yeah,
just borrowed money.
As we speak, their economy is slowing, maybe even struggling.
Enormous debt burden, and my expectation for some years has been that the debt crisis, which is going to hit all of us, is probably going to start in China. So a little bit of this is a bubble. In fact, a good bit of this is a bubble. But it's also fairly normal behavior for a country that until very recently was very weak and poor. And as the Chinese actually invent and develop more things themselves, as opposed to copying other people, and this is happening, the flow will start to become bidirectional. Now, always when we're talking immigration, we have to be careful who we let in. In general, I view East Asians as a positive addition to our country. Ironically, Confucian values and standard Western middle class values work rather well together. And I would certainly rather be taking intelligent East Asians, many of whom do bring money here to invest, over a flood of peasants from our southern border. So that doesn't change the fact that we want to maintain the basic character of our country. We want to always make sure that native-born Americans have the advantage over immigrants when it comes to employment, things like that. And so it's entirely appropriate for us to have suitable immigration quotas for everyone.
Ideally.
Yeah. Also, regarding China's rise, I think another advantage they have is that they're being an Anthill Society. They don't really have the hang-ups regarding human dignity or life that we do. Pollution for one. Also, just another point in the news this week was that a genetically engineered baby was born in China. Looking further into the future and maybe just kind of, as a hypothetical, imagine that there's Chinese engineered supermen with 200 IQ and, they're 7 feet tall and super strong because they're genetically engineered. How do we compete with those Chinese? Because we aren't willing to embrace this technology and go all the way.
You're talking about Yao Ming, right?
Yeah, right, of course.
The answer is that the negative side effects of genetic engineering are going to be so overwhelming that I'm much more worried about that than about Superman. We are going to get genetically engineered plagues of people, animals, crops, everything else that you can't even begin to imagine, partly by design and a good bit of it by accident. If you look at Chinese history, the way China works is things are decreed at the center, and then they are implemented elsewhere with very little concern for after effects, side effects, local conditions, and the result, more often than not, is a colossal disaster. So it's easy to look at the Chinese and see the plus sides of their Anthill Society. But history says it also has a lot of downsides as well. And I think it won't be very long before we're seeing some of those. Chinese agricultural policy is going to leave China completely dependent on imported food. They're essentially destroying all the farming villages and moving people into cities. This is a disastrous course of action. They are paving a lot of their small amount of arable land, which is another disaster because they decided to become an automobile society. And if you can imagine an anthill where every ant has a car, you immediately see the problem. And especially because, again, China's arable land is a very small portion of its total land area. So this is a long story in Chinese history. And I wouldn't get so swept away by the splendor of the Forbidden City that I didn't see the probable downsides that are coming here.
I guess the thing that's been perpetuated is basically everyone in the world deserves a middle American lifestyle. And that's a big problem. Also, we can't feasibly do it. We would need 10 planets in order to have the resources to really make that even possible.
And we can't even really do it ourselves.
And we can't, we can't even do it just as our own nation. So I guess it gets to a point where does that mean we're basically headed towards a material war over raw material, or if the economy doesn't crash first, is that kind of the next step?
Probably just a big reset.
Right.
I think that what we're more likely to see, and this is something that deals with problems in virtually all modern societies, is a reevaluation of how we use a lot of our resources, because we use a great many of them tremendously inefficiently. And a lot of that inefficiency comes, ironically, from too much, not too little industrial approach to things that are not by their nature industrial in nature, like agriculture. So I think there are reasons why many conservatives, including myself, are very much, help yourself, are very much interested in things like organic farming and the return of the small family farm, diversified crops, moving away from genetically engineered crops, all these Roundup ready crops, and so forth. This application of industrialism to non-industrial areas is extremely problematic and again, very inefficient in terms of use of resources. So I think the entire world is going to have to face these problems. It's not unique to this or that society. And I think real conservatism, which values the ways we used to do things and realizes that the old ways are in many cases better than the new ways, has a great deal to contribute to facing up to the fact that we can't keep adopting industrial solutions to non-industrial problems.
Right.
Bill, what's your take on, you said, the industrial establishment puffs up, they puff up Russia to beat Russia, they puff up China to beat China. You look at the size of these islands that they talk about, like the Spratlys, all these other islands, and they say, oh, the Chinese are going to take these islands. You actually Google these things and take a look at them. Most of these islands are nothing more than a rock sticking out, in the middle of the ocean. And like you said, they're not going to shoot themselves in the foot and close down trade. Like that's how they eat. They would be shooting themselves in the foot if they did that. So I guess two questions for you. Like, in your opinion, do the Chinese want to actively challenge, America's power? And if they did, what does that look like, on the ground? I mean, where are they going to expand to? Like, are they going to go to Afghanistan? I don't think so. Are they going to go into the ocean? Like, what does that buy them? And what's your take on that?
Well, I think that China normally follows its historic patterns. You have to understand China's civilization and culture. You have to realize it's as if ancient Egypt was still recognizably with us. If you look at something from Shang Dynasty China, which is a possibly mythical first dynasty, you immediately say that's Chinese. So they have this enormous continuity, which is very different from the history of the West. And their continuous approach to foreign policy has been that they want a buffer of client states around them, but they don't want to expand beyond that because they don't want to have to deal with more barbarians, which is still how they regard the rest of the world. So I don't see a Chinese drive for the universal monarchy, as it was called in the days of Philip II, a complete world hegemony.
Right.
I think they do want their traditional network of client states around them, and that's perfectly legitimate. Most of these islands, as you say, they amount to virtually nothing. Plus, one of the lessons of World War II in the Pacific is that the Japanese thought in terms of drawing lines in the water. They found out the hard way that lines in the water mean nothing. Chinese are now doing it with their 7-dash line, and good luck, guys. Lines in the water mean precisely nothing. The islands become strategic liabilities very quickly. We've seen that in warfare for hundreds of years. Ask the French about the fortress now in Canada, Louisbourg. The same islands hopping strategy that we used in the Pacific could be used against any network of islands trying to create a line in the water. The whole concept is nonsense. So the Chinese are thinking in terms that, frankly, strategically simply don't work. That's a blunder on their part. But the islands themselves amount to nothing. And the notion that we should go to war for uninhabited pieces of rock halfway around the world is beyond absurd. As you've said many times, Jeff, the reason we are looking at China and Russia as enemies is because that's what the military-industrial congressional complex needs to try to justify $1 trillion a year for so-called defense. The fact is we are not going to go to war with Russia or China because they're both nuclear powers. Why do you think during the whole of the Cold War, we and the Soviets were very careful never to have US and Soviet military forces directly engage each other? Because obviously whoever is losing, the pressure on them to go nuclear is enormous.
Right.
It's too risky. So this is all spooky. It's all show for the rubes out in flyover land so that we continue to provide the $1 trillion a year out of our large and generous incomes. to fund an irrelevant military.
Right. Got it.
One last piece of news. On November 26th, the InSight Mars lander landed on Mars. It launched on May 5th, so it took quite a while to get all the way from Earth to Mars. But maybe not as much as you might think it takes for hundreds of millions of miles to be traveled. Bill, really, I brought this up because I wanted to know, what is the Kirkians' take on space travel?
Well, first of all, I'm a little disappointed about that landing because in the past, the Martian air defenses have been pretty good. Most of the probes that have been sent from Earth to Mars haven't made it.
That's
So
true.
I'm hoping the little green men up there, as they're paddling their canals, are not letting their air defenses fall apart. But from a Kirkian perspective, I will say only that I think that we have a good number of people in this country who would benefit the rest of us by moving to Mars.
Fair enough.
And I have one small bit of news. I am happy to say that in October, I just found out about it, the New York Times attacked Victoria, my novel of fourth generation war set here in North America. And because it talks about what cultural Marxism is doing to our country, and the Times said there is no such thing as cultural Marxism. My answer is read the history of the Frankfurt School, and there are many volumes written about it. You cannot read the history and not see the development of what we know as political correctness coming from the Frankfurt School's Western Marxism.
Since most of our public is illiterate, it'd be easier just to go to college, just to find that out.
Yes, you did that, Johnny. Yeah, yes, after you finally walked away from it after 3 years of them stuffing at your throat.
2 different schools, yeah. So, yeah.
So yes, anybody who thinks there is no such thing as college as cultural Marxism, enroll in a college, and you will find very quickly just how real it is. So this goes down in the category of more fake news from the New York Times.
Bill, what do you think about like that? So people have a problem with saying that, like the word cultural Marxism, but people like Jordan Peterson, who have gotten a huge following, they call it, they say it has all the same characteristics that you ascribe to it, but he calls it postmodern neo-Marxism. So he's saying that, I mean, in your opinion, is there a difference in the Frankfurt School of 1923 versus what's being applied in America today? Because I read a book from Peterson that he recommended. It's called Explaining Postmodernism, and how the failure of the communist ideologies, in war, in practice, in Europe, they all failed. And so they went back to the drawing board to come up with this idea of postmodernism. We got the modern world from the Renaissance. Then postmodernism is that there is no such thing as race. There is no such thing as gender. They're all social constructs. Like those things coming out of the schools from Hegel and in 1923, or are those a new invention of the American? Is there a difference in the cultural Marxist flavor in Germany and then the flavor in the United States, or are they one and the same?
The reason it's cultural Marxism is because what the Frankfurt School did, and yes, it's founded in 1923, but it does most of its work in the 1930s, 1940s. What they did is they took classical Marxism and translated it from economic into cultural terms. Of course, they had to contradict Marx in order to do this, because Marx says that culture is simply part of the superstructure, which is determined by the ownership of the means of production. They said, no, actually culture is an independent and very important variable. So if you look, for example, at economic Marxism, it says automatically workers and peasants are good, capitalists and bourgeoisie are bad, regardless of what any of them do. With the new cultural Marxism, it's blacks, Hispanics, certain other ethnic groups, gays, feminist women, etc., are good. Whites, non-feminist women, white males, straights, etc., are bad. They have simply translated all of the categories from the economic terms into the cultural terms. So the essence of it really is precisely that it is cultural Marxism. The term postmodernism, in any case, to me, is a misleading one. What postmodernism is, in the minds of most of the people who write about it, is simply the reductio ad absurdum of modernism itself. Real postmodernism is the rejection of modernism and the return, in many ways, to the pre-modern understanding that is exemplified by, say, the Middle Ages, which did not oppose faith and reason, but rather united the two.
Okay.
So I find the whole term postmodernism to be, not surprisingly, a misnomer and a bit of a misleading concept, and I suspect at least part of that misleading is intentional.
Interesting.
We got a couple emails. Thank you to the people that sent them. Reminder that if you have a question or comment, feel free to leave it in the chat or send us an email, traditionalright@gmail.com, and we can read it live and address it. So the first one comes from Carlos. I won't read last names unless you give me permission to identify you, just so you know. Carlos wrote us a nice long email. Basically, he says that he disagrees with your article on the invasion of our southern border. He says essentially that the optics would be bad if we had troops on the border shooting invaders or landmines or what have you. Instead, he suggests we take a more proactive approach and have programs and whatnot to keep people in the countries where they are by providing something for them or just having some kind of program to keep them there instead of letting them get all the way to the border and addressing it as a military threat. Bill, what do you have to say about that?
Well, first of all, one of the things that we should have learned long ago is that our ability to go into a dysfunctional foreign society and suddenly make it function is somewhere between 0 and nothing. We have tried to do that repeatedly. This is nation building. We don't understand how those societies work. It doesn't work. Carlos is correct that if you have snipers and machine gunners at the border shooting the people down, the optics are terrible. That's what I addressed in my column. And I pointed out that there's a way to change that. We need to go to passive border defenses, landmines, automatic machine guns, high voltage electric fences, all the sorts of things you saw, for example, on the old East-West German border. Because if you have passive defenses, it shifts the moral equation. Instead of you being monsters for machine gunning women and children, they're idiots for walking into clearly labeled minefields. So he's half right, in effect. But the notion that we can solve this problem by remaking places like El Salvador and Honduras, only on Mars.
So Insight is in a good position then.
Insight?
The Mars lander.
Insight, yes. Okay, the Mars lander. We should probably call it Hoping for Insight.
Oh, by the way, it has a really spectacular acronym. Insight is in fact an acronym. It stands for Interior Exploration Using Seismic Investigations, Geodesy, and Heat Transport.
That's funny until you realize the government spent $50 million in the taxpayers' money paying a consultant up with it.
Exactly. All right, so our second email comes from Philip. He says that, let's see, someone from the USMC told him that in an email that the thought of tactics as the art and science of winning battles and engagements was a favorite construction of Bill Lynn's. I'm wondering where this idea came from. Is it Clausewitz?
No, it simply comes from observation. In other words, back when we were putting together the warfare doctrine for the Marine Corps, we were wrestling with how do we define things like tactics. And that definition is important because it says you can't reduce it to techniques and procedures, because part of it is art and part of it is science. The science part you can reduce to techniques and procedures. But if you leave out the art part, you don't really have tactics. And the art in anything cannot be done by recipe, or you get paint by numbers art, which is to say really bad art, and we usually end up with paint by numbers tactics, which is to say really bad tactics. So the purpose of the definition, which is drawn again purely from historical observation, is to stress that it is a combination of the two elements. Particularly important in the case of the Marine Corps, because they constantly talk about TTP, tactics, techniques, and procedures. They lump the things, but they're opposites. It should be T for tactics / TP. The nature of techniques and procedures as formulaic is similar, but tactics is a whole different thing altogether. It's different in kind. And the phrase TTP pushes it all in the direction of being reduced to procedures, and you get paint by numbers war.
He has a second part to his question. I had difficulty understanding at first, but I think I get it now. This is in regards to the development of maneuver warfare during the defense reform movement. Was the intention to copy Blitzkrieg and use the OODA loop, John Boyd's OODA loop, as an explanation for its success, or rather was the central idea Boyd's and the historical references merely convenient illustrations as in patterns of conflict?
No, it starts with history, and the theory comes later. When I began the maneuver warfare debate, with the piece I wrote in 1976, it was published eventually in March 1977 Military Review. I had never heard of it. And so initially it is all based on Blitzkrieg. It's on the German development that actually Blitzkrieg is conceptually complete by 1918. They don't have the equipment or the structure to do it. But it is all based on that revolution in tactics that occurs in the German army in World War I. What Boyd did is he took that and also drawing on air combat, generalized it into a broader theory of conflict with obviously much broader applications, including to business, including to politics, including to sports, lots of things. So the history comes first and the theory comes later.
All
As
right.
I told you recently when I was down at Quantico, I trust you know you're all wearing spiked helmets.
All right. Well, that is all the news and the email that I've got. Before we wrap up, Bill, you've got your retroculture book coming out now, or is it out yet?
The retroculture book, I just found out it slipped a little. It is to be out in the first quarter. And of course, the retroculture movement that I hope it spawns plays a big role in Victoria. It is why after this country breaks up in fourth generation war, which is not a good development, Victoria is a warning. We are nonetheless able to rebuild our old society in part of what had been America because we turned back to the past. We realized that the Victorians got it right, that the America we want is the America we had pretty much up through the 1950s, and we set about recreating it.
And we'll be talking more about retroculture in the near future. That's kind of really it provides a way forward for us.
Yes.
I mean, the name retroculture implies that you're looking back, but it's actually the path that we'll take to win, to go forward.
It's when you realize that you've been on the wrong road, the first thing you do is turn back. And so it's the future informed by the lessons of the past. And we shouldn't end up without Jeff, you also getting a chance to talk about your book, which is a good one, and which I recommend particularly to all of our military folks out there, and I know
he was next on my list. Jeff, what's your book?
Good.
Yeah, so I've got my book here, American Cobra Pilot, A Marine Remembers a Dog and Pony Show. So it's about a lot of things. I think I talked about it centered on a Korean exercise on the last one, but what I'd like to plug for it on this live stream was I just got an email today from a fan through my website that was he's a former lieutenant colonel, and he was in the military at the same time I was, and he references one of the emails I have in my books. We're talking about cultural Marxism. It's not real. Well, I reference in the book emails that we were given that said that minorities and females need to go to a diversity conference because there's too many white males staying in the military through their careers. They need to figure out why there isn't enough diversity, which we all know means less white guys. So he sent me an email and said, like, I was in when I saw that email. When I saw that email, I knew that he was in Okinawa at the same time. And he said, it propelled me over the edge. I was fortunate enough to have early retirement, but it was then that I realized that I had to get out. So we've got some lieutenant colonels that are reading the book and liking what I have to say. So it's about a lot of things, and cultural Marxism in the military is definitely one of them. So buy the book. It's funny too. It's not very serious. It's serious, but it's satire. So it's funny for a deeper moral point.
What's your website?
AmericanCobraPilot.com.
Great.
And the problem with satirizing today's American military is
you can't tell the difference
from the reality.
Yeah, exactly. You can't tell what's right or what's true and what's made up. So yeah.
All right. Well, everyone, thank you for doing the live stream with me again tonight. We will plan to do these every week, but I reserve the right to take a Thanksgiving break here and there. Our website is traditionalright.com. I'm assuming most people are coming from there, but if not, check us out there. Bill's articles are weekly, and we've got plenty of other material coming shortly. More articles, a podcast, and some video content, so look for that. Thanks again for listening, and we will catch up with you next time.